Class 19, we're continuing on with Zone 9 thinking. So, one of the big areas in cognition research is about problem solving. So, what do we mean by problem solving? Problem solving is finding an appropriate way to attain a goal when the goal is not readily available, right? So, if the goal is not readily available, that's a problem. We need to find an appropriate way to attain that goal anyway, which is the process of problem solving. So, problem solving is not unique to humans, although we typically think of humans in problem solving. So, here's a quick video to illustrate that problem solving is something that animals do as well. So, the goal here is well, the dog can smell that there's food in the toaster oven. Dog wants to eat the food, but it's hard to get the food, it's not readily available. So, what does the dog do to get the food? Still no food here. Yep, that's where the food smell's coming from. But how to get over there? But wait, there's still more food. This worked the first time. Let's try it again. And there we go. Goal attained. So as you see, the goal was eat the tasty food. It was hard to get the food. So Doggy came up with a little plan, tried one thing, didn't work, tried something else, that seemed to work better, and then Doggy was able to just repeat that process. This worked the first time, gonna do it again, and ultimately got the food. So there are certain steps that help in the problem solving process. First, you have to identify the problem. What's the problem that needs to be solved? And frame the problem in a way that we can start to tackle it. So put it into context or put it into as simple of words as possible so we can identify what is the problem. Then it helps to develop some good problem solving strategies. And so these might be trial and error. For example, if you are trying to identify why something's not working, you may try something, see if that helps. doesn't work, try something else, see if that works, right? So we're more familiar with trial and error, but we also have things called algorithms and heuristics. And so we'll talk about what each of those are in a moment. Step 3 is to really evaluate the solutions. And in order to evaluate the possible solutions, you really have to identify what counts as success. What is the criteria for success in this case? If you're writing a paper, maybe success is just finishing the paper. Getting it done might be enough to solve your problem. Or you may want to write an A paper. And so that's a slightly different problem from just finishing the paper. And if you're trying to write something worthy of publication, of course, that's an even different type of problem. So really evaluate. If you want to write a paper, well, what is going to count as success? Because you have to know what counts as success in order to appropriately work towards that success. And then it always helps to rethink and redefine the problems and solutions over time. If something, again, isn't working out, rethink about it. Think about the key of the problem, go back and evaluate and redefine the problem and try different solutions. People who are good problem solvers are generally motivated to improve their past performance, and they're motivated to make original contributions. So in step 2, we talked about some good problem solving strategies. So we're going to go a little more into that. So algorithms are strategies, including formulas, instructions, or testing all possible solutions. So these are strategies that guarantee a solution to a problem. If you think about very detailed instructions for a recipe, if you follow the recipe exactly, then you should end up with the same result, right? The proper end product. That's an algorithm, something that's laid out very detailed, start to finish. If you get a bookcase from IKEA, it comes with instructions. Those instructions, that's an algorithm. If you follow the instructions exactly, then you should at the end have a proper bookcase. Following driving directions is another type of algorithm. As long as you follow them and there's, for example, no detours or something that happens, then you'll get to the end point and you'll find a solution to your problem. Algorithms are something that computers use. For example, Google, when you type into Google, computers are running algorithms to try to determine what are the best options to present to you, right? And so that is also a type of problem solving. Algorithms are great if you have one, if you have the time, but unfortunately, they're not always possible. Or if they are, they might take a very long time to do. So, one thing that humans typically use to help with that process is something called heuristics. And heuristics are really just shortcut strategies or guidelines that help to suggest a solution to a problem, although they don't necessarily guarantee an answer. So, for example, if you're playing Scrabble and you end up with the tile Q, we know that in the English language, if you have a Q, you're generally going to need a U. So that's a heuristic. It's kind of like a shortcut. You want to look for something that has a Q and a U, for example. Right? So think of these as rules of thumb, and we have different heuristics that we use, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment. Another really good problem solving strategy is to break your problem into sub goals. So instead of just focusing on the very long term ultimate goal that you're hoping to achieve, break it down into intermediate goals or intermediate problems that help to put you in a better position to reach the final goal or solution. And this is something that you may do, for example, if you know that you have a big project due or a big paper due. If you plan to first start with conducting the research that you need to do for that project or paper, that's the first step. Identify all the information you need. Then you may have another sub goal of creating an outline of the information. And then the next sub goal would be write a first draft. With the end product would be, the complete polished paper. But you can break it down into steps along the way. It's a very effective way of helping us to solve problems without it being too overwhelming. So for example, you may plan out different dates that you have to have certain things completed by in order to have the final paper when you need it. And something that works well with sub goals is working backwards. Start at what the ultimate goal is and then work backwards from there. What do you need to achieve just before the end goal? What about just before that and before that? And this helps you to plan out your strategy. There are several pitfalls that as humans we experience when it comes to problem solving. Things that are very common sort of mistakes or ways that we get stuck trying to solve a problem. And one of those is called fixation. Fixation is when you sort of get stuck with a prior strategy. You can only think about a prior strategy and you have a hard time finding a fresh perspective. So you really get fixated on one thing and you're not able to be flexible with your thinking to help you solve the problem. A more specific kind of type of fixation is what we call functional fixedness. Functional fixedness is really fixating on the usual functions of something without sort of seeing all the other ways that the object could be used. So, for example, if you have a hammer, you may only think of the hammer as something to hammer a nail. But realistically, you can use a hammer for other things. I may use it to prop up the book that I'm reading, or I could use it to as a door as a door stop so my door stays open. I could use my hammer to grab something up of a high shelf that I can't reach. Right, so there are different uses for things. We can use objects in all sorts of ways, but functional fixedness is when you really get stuck on only thinking about an object in the way that you usually think about it based on its usual function. So in this image example, the woman is saying, "Gosh, it's hot. What should I do?" Well, she's reading a book. Why not use the book as a fan? Right? So thinking about objects outside of their normal roles. And one of the classic kind of problems that has been used in studying this functional fixedness is called the Meyer string problem. So I'm going to show a quick video that shows what that is.
You can take this test right from your living room.
This is a simple game, really. All you have to do is tie two ropes together. But the problem is these two ropes don't easily reach each other. So that's going to require you to come up with a creative solution. You have the chair, paint can, and a pair of pliers that you can use to solve this problem.
Take a second and consider what you would do to tie this 5-foot rope to this 4-foot rope. Keep trying as these college students also take on the challenge.
You understand what you have to do?
I gotcha.
Tie the ropes together?
Yes.
You can't reach both ropes from the floor, but simply standing on the chair won't help. You're going to have to get creative.
I'm going to tie the chair.
Okay.
Seem impossible? We assure you it can be done.
Yeah, it's not gonna work.
Do you feel like giving up too? Well, before you do, let's find out what might be standing in your way.
When you're trying to think of the uses for the objects in the room, you have a hard time thinking of a use that you haven't encountered in your lifetime.
You're not born knowing what a paint can is, but over time, you form associations, such as what a paint can looks like and how it works. Object association is an activity that takes place in a region of the temporal lobe.
If we can prime people to think of a can of paint in a completely different way, that can really help us solve the problem instantly.
So, how does this apply to the ropes challenge and the objects provided? First, you have to add weight to one rope to create a pendulum. What can you use for weight? Here's where that creative thinking comes in handy.
You've gotten very close. You're very close.
Swing the paint can pendulum. Then, while holding onto the other rope, stand on the chair and catch the pendulum as it swings in your direction. With the ends of the ropes now in close proximity, you can release the paint can and tie the ropes.
Yay!
Okay.
You got it! Yeah!
Did it.
Good job!
That was not easy.
Have you ever used a paint can as a pendulum before?
No, I have not.
Is it the first time?
Yes, it is.
I need to get in the gym.
I did that. Yes.
Congratulations on completing the Total Mental Fitness Challenge. The two ropes problem required your concentration to slow down and take in the details, and your mental flexibility to stretch and find a creative solution.
So that
You can
illustrates
take
a
this
case of functional fixedness, focusing only on the paint can as a receptacle for paint. So what helps in problem solving a lot of the times is something I'm sure you've heard of, thinking outside the box. So, this is exploring new ways to approach tasks or challenges or new ways to find solutions. And so, each of these examples kind of illustrates somebody thinking outside the box. On the far left, we see a man who has used a table as a sort of raft to attach a motor to, and now it's a boat. In the middle, we have someone making s'mores using a rake so that they can do all the marshmallows and heat up the chocolate with the graham crackers at the same time. Very smart. And on the far right, we have somebody who has repurposed a rake head into a jewelry holder. So, again, thinking more creatively is often something that will help, especially when you get stuck in a problem. Try to think of the tools that you have at your disposal in a new way. Is there a different way you can think about what you have, your resources and your tools, that is going to help you? Here's a quick example that I'd like you to try. So this is the 9-dot problem. Here we have 9 dots in an array, and the task is to connect or draw a straight line through all 9 dots with no more than 4 straight lines. This would be really easy if you could pick up your pen from the paper, but the goal is to touch your pen to the paper and in 4 straight lines, find a way to draw a line through all of those dots. So I encourage you at this point to pause the video, draw out your 9 dots, and see if you can do it. It seems straightforward, but when you try, it can be really tricky. So go ahead, pause the video here, see how you do. Don't pick up your pen from your paper. Can you draw with 4 straight lines through all of the 9 dots? So here is the solution. People tend to get really stuck on this problem because we look at the 9 dots and we think that we have to stay within the constraints of the dots. However, that's not one of the instructions, right? You can't lift your pen from the paper, but there's nothing saying you can't go sort of outside, literally outside the box to complete it. So here's one solution. And again, you could rotate it different ways, but it requires, so we would do 1, 2, extending beyond the dots. So we can do a straight line through 2 more. That's 3 lines. And finally finish it with a 4th line. So here are the 9 dots. It requires going outside the lines. Now, some other problem-solving pitfalls that are pretty common for humans. So one is called confirmation bias, and this is probably something you've heard of before. It's a really big thing. It's something that happens for everybody. And confirmation bias is really our tendency to focus on information that confirms what we already think or what we already believe. This completely connects with if you think of politics, right? If you could have a debate with different sides of the aisle in terms of politics, and people will focus on the information that supports what they already believe. We are programmed to pay attention to the stuff that supports what we think and what we believe and validates us, and sort of dismiss or ignore the rest of the information. So unfortunately, this is how the brain works. We've got this cell saying, "Sir, we're receiving information that conflicts with our core belief system." And another cell says, "Get rid of it." Right? So this is something that is very hard to control. It's an automatic process that when you take in information, we tend to focus on the stuff that confirms what we think already. So we feel valid as people. Another very common problem-solving pitfall is the hindsight bias. So hindsight bias is after something has happened, thinking that you should have been able to predict what happened, right? So even if it was impossible, after the fact, we often say, "Oh, I should have seen that coming," or "I should have known better," or "Oh, I could have predicted that that would happen." But really, in the moment, you couldn't. It's only with the hindsight, being able to look backwards on what happened, that that it seems predictable. This is something, an example of that would be if, for example, you've ever gone through a breakup and you tell your friends or your family that you've gone through a breakup, and people say, "Oh, I always thought that he wasn't very good for you or she wasn't very good for you, whatever," right? So after the fact, people are quick to say, "Oh, I always thought this," or "I could see this happening." But in reality, we can't. We think so. Our brain sort of tricks us into thinking we should have known better at the time, but sometimes it's just not possible. We couldn't have predicted what was going to happen. Here's a heuristic. So this is something that we use as humans as a shortcut to help us in making judgments, decisions, problem solving. This is called the availability heuristic. So the availability heuristic predicts the probability or likelihood of something based on how easy it is to recall the information related to it. So this is something that relates to, for example, plane crashes, right? If you look up the statistics, you are far more likely, sorry, this is kind of morbid, but you are far more likely to die in a car crash than in a plane crash. Plane crashes are really actually quite rare. People tend to overestimate how common they are because when a plane crashes, it makes big news, right? It's all over the news. We hear all about it that a big plane crashed and people died. Because we hear about it so often, when it happens, we tend to think it happens more often than it really does. Versus car crashes happen all the time, and unfortunately, fatal car crashes happen somewhat often. But usually, when there's a car crash, it doesn't make the news. It's not a big deal in terms of the news because they happen fairly frequently. But the availability heuristic means that people tend to be maybe more afraid to fly because we hear about the plane crashes than we are to drive a car. We get in the car and drive it like there's no problem, when really you're much more likely to get in a car crash than a plane crash. So the availability heuristic is all about what is most salient or kind of easiest to access in your brain, in your mind, in your memory. The information that's easiest to access that comes to the forefront, we tend to overestimate how often those things happen. Another bias that we have as people is called the representativeness bias. And this really has to do with making judgments about people or situations based on stereotypes. So, the representativeness bias, if you've ever had an experience where, let's say that you find out that one of your instructors, let's say, a biology instructor, likes to go windsurfing or something very, outdoorsy and active. You may be surprised by that because, there's this kind of stereotype about instructors that, oh, we're all kind of nerdy people, that maybe we're more likely to stay at home and read a book than to go out and do kind of fun things. So, if you've ever had an experience where you find out a fact about something that you find sort of kind of surprising because you sort of assumed something about them based on maybe how they look or their job or how they present themselves. That's the representativeness bias. Making judgments about people based on stereotypes, based on appearance, job, other characteristics. So here's a little example. So I want you to think about this, and you may even ask this question to several people around you and see what they say. If a random word is taken from an English text, is it more likely that the word starts with an R or that R is the third letter? So mull that over for a moment. Feel free to pause the video and think about it. Which one do you think is more likely? That the word will start with an R or have R as the third letter? Now, often people will say that they think it's more likely that the word starts with R because we can very readily start thinking of lots of words that start with R. Revise, record, read, room, ruler, rabbit, right? There's a lot of words that start with R. However, in the English language, there are a lot more words that have R as the third letter. They're just harder to think of because what should we start with? If we really sit down and think, you may start thinking, okay, spring, string, tore, tire, Mm, right? It's harder to come up with those because we got to start with a different letter. So people tend to overestimate the things that come to mind easily and underestimate the things that come to mind more harder. I don't think that's proper grammar, but you know what I mean. So in this case, it is more likely that the word would have R as a third letter, but we tend to overestimate and think that it would be more likely to have a word that starts with an R. So this is an example of the availability heuristic. The fact that it's easy to think of words that start with R makes us think that they're more common than they are. Another example. Linda is 31 years old. She's single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now think about the following question. Which do you think is more likely? That Linda's a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? Again, feel free to pause the video here, think it over. Which do you think is more likely based on what we know? Typically, people tend to say it's more likely that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement based on the information that was presented about her involvement with social justice movements, right? The feminist movement is a social justice movement. So people tend to think, well, if she's involved in social justice and participate in anti-nuclear demonstrations, then she's probably active in the feminist movement. Therefore, it's more likely that she's a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement. However, it is much less likely for two things to be true about Linda than just one thing, right? In the first case, Linda's a bank teller. Okay, that has a certain likelihood attached to it. In the second case, not only are we saying she's a bank teller, meaning that there's a certain likelihood, but even within that group, we get to a smaller group saying that she's active in the feminist movement. So really, anytime we have two things being true, that's less likely than just one thing being true. So in this case, it's more likely that Linda's a bank teller. You may have picked up on some of the cues or description of her and thought, must be active in the feminist movement. So in this case, what's happening is we're experiencing representativeness bias, right? Making a judgment about somebody based on what's readily available about them, right? So those stereotypical things. So she's involved in social justice, then she must be a feminist. Or you might say, oh, if she's involved in social justice, she must be a Democrat, right? So we make these judgments all the time about people. Sometimes they're wrong, right? Sometimes they're not, but sometimes they are. And so this is a bias that we have as humans that is very hard to overcome. And it's a bias that affects everybody. We all experience this consciously or unconsciously, right? It's not necessarily a malicious thing. It's not that we're trying to be bad or trying to be judging of people. It's just the way our minds work. Our minds are wired in a certain way to try to solve problems quickly. And so our brain goes, up, I know people who are interested in social justice and they're typically feminists. So she must be a feminist. Again, it helps to take a step back and reevaluate and really think about what you know and general likelihoods before making judgments about people, right? This is something that gets triggered very often with things related to gender, race, socioeconomic status, career. There's all sorts of things that we make judgments about people thanks to the representative bias that maybe aren't accurate. So, another big area in cognition is intelligence. And so I'd like you to take a moment and pause the video and think about the word intelligence. What does it mean? What do you think it means to be intelligent? What does that mean? If you could draw a picture of intelligence, what would that look like? So take a moment, pause, and just explore your thoughts on this. Now, the thing is that Intelligence or definitions of what intelligence is, those definitions reflect the culture that they're in. Intelligence doesn't have just one definition. There's lots of different definitions of intelligence, and who you ask may tell you something different. If you ask somebody in maybe a rural area in a Middle Eastern country, they may have a very different definition of what intelligence is versus somebody from LA or New York. Right? So, intelligence really reflects the culture. In the US, we typically think of intelligence as a sort of all purpose ability to do well on cognitive tasks, things like solving problems and the ability to learn from experience, right? We generally think of it in terms of problem solving and, you know, being book smart and learning words for things and being able to perform cognitive tasks. This is not the case in all cultures, right? There are different types of intelligence. People define intelligence differently, but this is generally what we think of in the US. In the US, one of the very first people who started to discuss intelligence was somebody named Spearman. And he came up with Spearman's G, which just represented general intelligence. And this was really thought of as kind of the jack of all cognitive traits. So if you think of being very analytical, problem solving, that's sort of what we tend to think of as intelligence in the US, or at least traditionally, it's what we've thought of. There are many theories of what intelligence is. One of the other theories is by a man named Cattell. Cattell's theory of intelligence was that we really have sort of two types of intelligence. We have crystallized intelligence, which is basically like learning facts and figures. It's the type of learning of, for example, book smart, what you think of. If you go into a class, if you start a psychology class and you come out and you know a lot of facts about psychology, that's crystallized intelligence. It's acquired knowledge and then being able to go back into your memory and retrieve that knowledge for those facts, those figures, those definitions, the procedures that you learned. That's what we typically think of as crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is really more about being able to see relationships between things, being able to think abstractly and solve problems, not just remembering information that you've been taught, but being able to use your intelligence in new situations, the ability to learn new things or to think about things in a new way. So, fluid intelligence is much more related to solving that Myers string problem where you have to think outside the box than crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence, we would think, okay, there's a paint can, I can hold paint in it, right? You know what a paint can typically does. It takes that fluid intelligence, the ability to see relationships and problem solve, which is more of a way of thinking versus more of a storage of information. There are several theories of intelligence that really break intelligence into sort of more multiple types of intelligence. And one of the big ones is Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence. So Sternberg felt that people have different types of intelligence: analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. For Sternberg, he thought analytical intelligence is what we maybe tend to think of in the US as intelligent. Academics, problem solving, computations, being analytical. That's more what we tend to think of as intelligent in the kind of typical IQ sense in the US. He didn't think that was the only type of intelligence there is, though. He thought there's also creative intelligence, which is more similar, I would say, to kind of that fluid intelligence we were just talking about. Creative intelligence is just what it sounds like: being creative, being able to invent or imagine solutions to a problem or a situation. More of that thinking outside the box type of intelligence. And finally, he thought that we also have something called practical intelligence, which really is sort of like street smarts. Being able to work in sort of everyday life and apply your knowledge that you've gained through your experiences to achieve whatever you have to do in your circumstances, right? Not necessarily being able to recite Pythagorean's theorem or to solve a quadratic equation or to come up with a solution to the Myers problem. This is more about knowing how to work in your environment and to solve sort of everyday life problems. Gardner also had a very sort of famous, well known theory of multiple intelligences. Gardner thought that we have at least 8 different types of intelligences, and that people may be strong in one or more of these areas. These are things like the verbal or linguistic intelligence, which is finding the right words to express what you mean. You may know people who are really good communicators, who are really good at writing papers, who are really good with their vocabulary and their linguistic expression. Those people probably would score very high in linguistic intelligence. Logical or mathematical intelligence is more of the traditional, what we tend to think of as intelligent. That would be like quantifying things, being able to make hypotheses and prove them, being very logical. This is more of a Sheldon Cooper type of intelligence. Spatial intelligence is about being able to visualize the world in 3D. I know people who have terrible senses of direction. They couldn't tell you which way is north, south, east, or west, right? Even if they're looking at a map. They would probably score very low in spatial intelligence. There are other people who just seem to have a feel for the world around them. They're able to sort of visualize the world in 3D. They can hold maps in their heads, or they can think of spaces in better ways than other people. Those would be people who are high in spatial intelligence. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is being able to coordinate your mind with your body. So, people who are, for example, maybe trained dancers or who are MMA fighters, people who are good with using their body effectively and getting their body to do what they want their body to do, would score high in bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Interpersonal and intrapersonal have to do with being intelligent in terms of both interpersonal contact, so interacting with other people, sensing other people's feelings and motives. If you can imagine somebody you know who's a people person, they just they seem to get people really well. They can sense people's feelings, they work well with people. Those would be people who score high in interpersonal intelligence. Intrapersonal intelligence is really about focusing inward. It's about understanding yourself, what you feel, what you want, being very introspective and able to be kind of in touch with your feelings and know what's going on with you. That is high intrapersonal intelligence. There's also naturalistic intelligence, which is related more to understanding living things and reading nature and understanding nature. And finally, musical intelligence. People who just seem to have a gift for music. They're good at discerning sounds, or they may have perfect pitch, or they're really good with tone and rhythm. There are people who seem to be able to pick up multiple instruments without very much effort. Those would be people who score very high in musical intelligence. Creative thinking is also something that cognitive psychologists are interested in. Because creative thinking can help us to find new solutions to problems, it is something that's very valuable. And so creativity in terms of cognition, in terms of psychology, is really the ability to generate, create, or discover new ideas, solutions, and possibilities. Again, this goes more with that thinking outside the box type of thinking. We also tend to think of creative thinking, or we break it down into a couple of different types of thinking. So, divergent thinking is the ability to think of many different solutions to the same problem. So, this is, for example, if you're brainstorming, what are some different things we could do to solve this problem? That's divergent thinking, thinking of many solutions to a problem. Convergent thinking is focusing in on what is the best way to solve the problem. So, identifying the single best solution to a problem versus identifying many different solutions. Both of these are very helpful when it comes to creative thinking. Being able to think of lots of solutions and then being able to kind of whittle down to what is the best solution. Some characteristics of creative thinkers tend to have strong inner motivation. They're motivated to find new solutions, to try something different. Creative thinkers also tend to be more flexible and playful with their thinking, willing to maybe look a little silly, right? Or willing to face risk. Creative thinkers tend to be more of risk takers. They don't know for sure that something's going to work, but they're going to try. And finally, creative thinkers tend to be good at objective evaluation of their work. So they tend to be good at, okay, giving something a try, trying a new way of thinking, and then looking back and seeing, how did this work? And evaluating it and thinking, could I do this differently and better? Or could I refine this in some way? There are lots of different things that influence intelligence. And this is one of the big questions that cognitive psychologists ask is, okay, even if we could come up with a common sort of idea of what intelligence is, what causes some people to be more intelligent than others? Where does our intelligence come from? And research shows that a lot of the influence on intelligence is genetic. So we talk about the heritability of characteristics or traits. That really is talking about what proportion of differences do we see in a group of people that's explained by their genetics. So heritability, if you think about the genes that you inherit from your parents, that's what we're talking about in terms of heritability. There's been lots of research and there's still a lot of argument over what percentage exactly of IQ is genetic. IQ does have a genetic component. They've shown this by looking at studies comparing intelligence or IQ between parents with adopted children, so non-biological, siblings, identical twins. So we've done a lot of studies to try to sort of tease apart, and we see that siblings IQs generally are correlated, but not as strongly as identical twins IQs are. So that suggests that there is a genetic component, but it's very, very hard to tease it apart because we can't really control for all the other things that influence intelligence. There are environmental influences on intelligence too. So it's not just you've got what you're born with and that's it, that's as smart as you can be. There are things that you can do or that research suggests you can do to increase your intelligence. And this really plays in with the idea of a fixed versus a growth mindset, right? It is possible to strengthen your brain. It's even possible to make your brain literally grow, as we saw in the past with those London taxi drivers whose brains were physically bigger or heavier in certain areas because they developed it so much. So, some environmental influences on intelligence that we see are some dietary supplements. So, you may have heard of like omega fish, omega oil, those kind of things. Um, there's some evidence that there are dietary supplements that can boost your intelligence. Educational interventions. This is a big one. If you seek to create some sort of intervention to help train people to think in a certain way, that's shown to increase intelligence as well. Interactive reading. Reading is a really big thing that influences intelligence, and especially interactive reading. So, if you're a parent, keep that in mind. Read to your kids and make it interactive, where you're reading with them and you're really visualizing. That plays a big role in intelligence, and specifically, probably in verbal intelligence. And studies show that preschool is also a good place to kind of cultivate intelligence. So, children who go to preschool tend to score higher on IQs than children who don't go to preschool. So, just some information out there. And then, because today is Halloween, I thought it might be nice to wrap up with a little video that has to do with the paranormal and really connects back to this idea of critical thinking and being critical and evaluating what we know, not jumping to conclusions, right? So I'll go ahead and let Miss Carrie Poppy tell you a little more about this.
8 years ago, I was haunted by an evil spirit. I was 25 at the time, and I was living in a tiny house behind someone else's house in Los Angeles. It was this guest house. It had kind of been dilapidated, not taken care of for a long time. And one night I was sitting there, and I got this really spooky feeling. Kind of the feeling like you're being watched, but no one was there except my 2 dogs, and they were just chewing their feet. And I looked around, no one was there, and I thought, okay, this is just my imagination. But the feeling just kept getting worse, and I started to feel this pressure in my chest, sort of like the feeling when you get bad news, but it started to sink lower and lower, and almost hurt. And over the course of that week, this feeling got worse and worse, and I started to become convinced that something was there in my little guest house haunting me. And I started to hear these sounds, this whoosh, kind of whisper, like something passing through me. And I called my best friend, Claire, and I said, I know this is gonna sound crazy, but I think there's a ghost in my house. I need to get rid of it. And she said, she's very open-minded, and she said, I don't think you're crazy. I think you just need to do a cleansing ritual. So get some sage and burn it and tell it to go away. So I said, okay. And I went and I bought sage, and I had never done this before, so set the sage on fire, waved it about, and said, go away. This is my house. I live here. You don't live here. But the feeling stayed. Nothing got better. And then I started to think, okay, well, now this thing's probably just laughing at me because it hasn't left, and I probably just look like this impotent, powerless thing that couldn't get it to go away. And so every day I'd come home, and you guys, this feeling got so bad that, I'm laughing at it now, but I would sit there in bed, and I would cry every night. And the feeling on my chest got worse and worse. It was physically painful. And I even went to a psychiatrist and tried to get her to prescribe me medicine, and she wouldn't, just because I don't have schizophrenia. Okay. And so finally I got on the internet and I Googled hauntings. And I came upon this forum of ghost hunters, but these were a special kind of ghost hunters. They were skeptics. And so they believed that every case of ghosts that they had investigated so far had been explained away by science. And I was like, okay, smart guys, this is what's happening to me, and if you have an explanation for me, I would love to hear it. And one of them said, okay, have you heard of carbon monoxide poisoning? And I said, yeah, like gas poisoning? So carbon monoxide poisoning is when you have a gas leak leaking into your home. And I looked it up, and the symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning include a pressure on your chest, auditory hallucinations, whoosh, and an unexplained feeling of dread. So that night, I called the gas company. I said, I have an emergency. Need you to come out. Don't want to get into the story now, but I need you to come out. They came out. I said, I suspect a gas leak. They brought their carbon monoxide detector, and the man said, it's a really good thing that you called us tonight, because you could have been dead very soon. 37% of Americans believe in haunted houses. And I wonder how many of them have been in one. And how many of them have been in danger? So that haunting story has led me to my job. I'm an investigator, and I'm an investigator in two senses. I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm also an investigator of the claims of the paranormal and claims of the spiritual. And that means a few things. Sometimes that means that I'm pretending to need an exorcism so that I can get, yes, that's right, so that I can go to an exorcist and see if he's using gimmicks or psychological tricks to try to convince someone that they're possessed. Sometimes that means I'm going undercover in a fringe group, which I report on for a podcast that I co-host. And I've done over 70 investigations like this with my co-host, Ross. And I would love to tell you that 9 times out of 10, science wins, it saves the day, it's all explained. That's not true. The truth is, 10 times out of 10, science wins, it saves the day. And that doesn't mean there's no such thing as a mystery. Of course there are mysteries, but a mystery is a mystery. It is not a ghost. Now, I believe there are two kinds of truth, and it's taken me a while to get to this place, but I think this is right, so hear me out. I think there is outer truth and there's inner truth. So if you say to me, there was a man named Jesus and he once existed, that's outer truth, right? We can go and we can look at the historical record, we can determine whether that seems to be true. And I would argue, it does seem to be true. If you say, Jesus rose from the dead, ooh, trickier. I would say that's an outer truth claim, because he physically rose or he didn't. I'm not going to get into whether he rose or he didn't. But I would say that's an outer truth claim. It happened or it didn't happen. But if you say, I don't care whether he rose from the dead, it's symbolically important to me, and that metaphor is so meaningful, so purposeful to me, and I'm not going to try to persuade you of it. Now you've moved it from outer truth to inner truth, from science to art. And I think we have a tendency to not be clear about this, to try to move our inner truths to outer truths, or to not be fair about it to each other, and when people are telling us their inner truths, to try to make them defend them by outer truth standards. So I'm talking here about outer truth, about objective things, and there was an objective reality in my haunted house, right? Now that I've told you about the gas leak, I doubt a single person here would be like, I still think there was a ghost too. Because as soon as we have these scientific explanations, we know to give up the ghost. We use these things as stopgaps for things that we can't explain. We don't believe them because of evidence, we believe them because of a lack of evidence. And so there is a group in Los Angeles called the Independent Investigations Group, or the IIG, and they do great work. They'll give a $10,000 prize to anyone who can show, under scientific conditions, that they have a paranormal ability. No one's done it yet, but they've had a couple people who claim that they were clairaudience, which means that they can hear voices either from the great beyond or they can read minds. And they had one person who was very sincere, who believed that he could read minds. So they set up a test with him, and this is the way it always works. The group says, okay, we have a protocol, we have a way to scientifically test this, do you agree with it? The person says yes, then they test it. It's very important that both sides agree. They did that, they tested him, and they said, okay, you know what, you weren't able to predict what Lisa was thinking outside, it matched up about the same as chance, looks like you don't have the power. And that gave them the opportunity to compassionately sit down with him and have a very difficult discussion, which basically amounted to, hey, we know you're sincere, and what that means is you do hear something in your head. And that guy got to make the very difficult decision, but really the life-changing decision about whether to go get help. We're actually helping people to make these connections that maybe before seemed like otherworldly explanations, help draw us into reality, and maybe change our lives for the better. Now, on the other hand, maybe one time it'll turn out to be true. Maybe we'll find out there are ghosts, and holy shit, it'll be the best thing. And every time I do one of these investigations, I still get so excited, and I'm like 75 into them, and still, I swear, on number 76, I'm gonna be like, this is the one! And I mean, maybe I'm just eternally optimistic, but I hope I never lose this hope. And I invite you to take this same attitude when people share their outer beliefs with you. When talking about testable claims, respect them enough to ask these good questions, challenge and see how you can examine them together. Because there's this idea that you can't respect a belief and still challenge it, but that's not true. When we jiggle the lock, when we test the claim, we're saying, okay, I respect you. I'm listening to what you're saying. I'm gonna test it out with you. Like, we've all had that experience where you're telling someone something and they're like, oh, it's really interesting, yeah. You know you're being had, but when someone says, really? Huh. It sounds a little sketchy to me, but okay, I'm listening. You at least know you're being engaged, you're being respected. And that's the kind of attitude we should have with these claims. That's showing someone that you care what they're saying. That's respect. Now, yes, most of these searches will come up empty, but that's how all of science works. Every cure for cancer so far has not panned out, but we don't stop looking and for two reasons. Because number one, the answer matters. Whether it's looking at the afterlife or the paranormal or the cure for cancer, it all amounts to the same question. How long will we be here? And two, because looking for the truth, being open-minded, and being willing to be wrong and to change your whole worldview, it is awe-inspiring. I still get excited at ghost stories every single time. I still consider that every group I join might be right, and I hope I never lose that hope. Let's all never lose that hope, because searching for what's out there helps us understand what's in here. And also, please have a carbon monoxide detector in your home. Thank you.
So I hope you found that entertaining. Keep in mind, psychology is a science, right? So uh, try to think back and internalize some of those things she said. Some wrap up. Our Zone 9 exit check will be due on Monday, this coming Monday, November 4th. The Zone 10 entry check is due on Monday at the same time. We're going to be starting our personality unit, which is typically a very fun one. I extended the required self assessment. It is now due tomorrow, Friday, 11/1, Friday, November 1st. Do it. It's very short. It should only take you 5, maybe 10 minutes at the most, but it's a really good chance to test how you're doing in this class. See how you're doing. Give me some feedback. Give yourself some feedback. Um, Something called metacognition, where we evaluate what we know, is very important in learning. That's another cognitive area. You may hear that in the future, metacognition, thinking about what we know, knowing what we know, thinking about what we think. Anyway, so do the self assessment. Test 2 will be released on Tuesday the 5th. You'll have a week to complete it. It will cover everything from Zone 6 through Zone 10. So don't do it unless you've had a chance to go through the material in Zone 10 personality yet, but you have a few days after we wrap that zone to give you a couple days to do some extra studying, and then go ahead and take that. I recommend everyone take it because free points, right? More points. More missions are being developed and coming soon. Got my visiting hours and study lab. Have a great weekend, everybody. Happy Halloween. Be safe out there. I pray everybody is not being negatively affected by the fires and the winds and the power outages. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you soon.